Super duper. Hello, everybody. This is the AKASHA Conversation, March 2022. Conversation number 4. I'm Philip Sheldrake of the AKASHA Foundation, and I'm just going to run through a few slides just to situate what we're trying to achieve here. So I'll just share my screen.
Maybe, Philip, before you start,
please do.
Let me say something now. So we start with these conversations. We always attach to all attendee a POAP, you know. So there's like a proof of attendance that will be sent to the attendees. And with this conversation, we start to take a new approach, and that is that all attendees that have enrolled on or registered on the Zoom account for this call have received an email with an invite code for Ethereum World. I will now, while Philip is doing the introduction, do a post on Ethereum on akasha.ethereum.world, and everyone is invited to write a response underneath that post that I'm doing, and that this is a way that we are going to be able to collect your Ethereum addresses, and to those Ethereum addresses, we then will send the POAP.
That makes sense.
Was it clear? So
AKASHA.ethereum.world.
I will leave the link to that post in the chat during the conversation. Okay.
You're a star. Thanks, Martin. Super duper. So the title of this conversation is The Perceived Legitimacy of Content Moderation. And we're delighted to have Amy Zhang join us. We have these conversations to explore critical questions when it comes to decentralized social networking. If you thought social networking was hard enough, try decentralizing it. So the idea is that we mix all variety of perspectives, contexts, cultures, insights with an expert who's just going to set something out for us so that we can then dive into some good quality conversation. We don't just have conversations at the AKASHA Foundation. We are doers as much as thinkers. So we like to experiment, to play, to put our ideas into action, to see where they fail, to see where they succeed. And our test bed for the AKASHA framework is Ethereum World, which is a new kind of social network in the making. One that's setting itself up as a public good, which means it's non-excludable and non-rivalrous, the URL at the bottom of the page there. It's important, I think, to define terms, otherwise we might be coming here and talking about something different for 60 minutes and talk past each other. So we like Grimmelman's definition that emphasizes moderating as a subset of governance, but also one that facilitates cooperation, positive feedback loops, as well as preventing abuse, negative feedback loops. So it's just worth situating, moderating. Now we are going to we're going to help co-create moderating systems for decentralized social networking. The purpose that the AKASHA Foundation has is way bigger than the foundation, so we can only do this open source, public domain, work together as a community, perhaps as a movement, if we can get enough people interested in this and as excited as we are at the vision. Now, we've already started this in terms of a moderating open design challenge. We're in week 5. Everything we're doing at the moment is completely open. We're not trying to boil the ocean. We're taking it one step at a time. So we're just trying to improve the current approaches. One way you can get involved at this stage of the first Open Design Challenge is to volunteer for us to run the ideas that are coming out in that challenge past you. Just give us an hour of your time so that we can find out what you make of what we've been talking about. And of course, you're always welcome to jump on our discourse channel as well. So we're delighted to be joined by Amy, an assistant professor at the Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington. Her research is in the field of human-computer interaction and social computing. Couldn't be more spot on for this conversation then. Her research involves designing and building systems to improve discourse, collaboration, and understanding the online world, with applications to social media, communities, news, civic engagement, education, and computer-supported cooperative work and collective action. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Amy. Thanks for joining us, Amy.
Awesome. Thank you for the great introduction, Philip. I'm excited to chat with you all today about my research. So let me get my slides up. Can you all see? Yes. All right. So I'm going to talk to you all today about designing legitimate moderation in decentralized online social platforms. And just to start off, just a little bit about my lab. So I run a lab at the University of Washington called the Social Futures Lab. Our motto is that we're trying to reimagine social and collaborative systems to empower people and to improve society. That's our website. You can check out all the papers that I'll be talking about in this talk, and just a little bit about where we sit disciplinarily. We're housed in a computer science department, and my training is all in computer science, but we also take a lot from aspects of design because we're working on building systems and working with people, and we also take a lot from social science, and in this talk, particularly aspects of political science. So, okay, so I'll start with what is legitimacy. So legitimacy is, in a nutshell, the right to govern. And this was developed, theorized a lot by folks like Max Weber and John Locke. And I'll break it down to two different types. One is perceived legitimacy, and this is oftentimes what people talk about when they talk about legitimacy, which is a belief that a particular rule or institution or leader has some authority to govern. And there is this implied or implicit consent provided by the governed to the governor in the cases where they feel it is legitimate. And contrast that with normative legitimacy, which are benchmarks that political scientists have developed for some measure of acceptability or justification of a political power or authority, and perhaps some obligation that those people have over the governed. And overall, I just want to say that legitimacy is a good thing. It's an important thing when it comes to governance because it helps governance happen more efficiently. It reduces strife and mistrust and upheaval, and it's overall more consensual. And I also wanted to say that something that is perceived legitimate may not be normatively legitimate, and vice versa. So for instance, you might have a really high perceived legitimacy in a government where a ruler claims to have divine powers, for instance, and the people believe that to be the case. And so that is a form of legitimacy. But that kind of rule might not score highly on some measures of normative legitimacy that are looking at some specific benchmarks, like the degree to which a governed has a say in governance. So, okay, that's very quick on legitimacy. And I wanted to then talk about this in the context of online social platforms. So, as we are moving all of our offline institutions and engaging with other people online, these questions of legitimacy, which previously we've really only used to talk about things like national governments, we're now also using to think about these online social platforms where you have millions, in some cases, over 1 million people on the same platform and being constrained by a particular governance. In this case, content moderation, the governance of user accounts, content, and other actions that happen on these online social platforms. And so then an increasingly important question, as more and more people are using these, is the governance on our major social media platforms legitimate? And to answer that question, I just wanted to bring up a few more concepts. So there are a lot of things that go into legitimacy in kind of like a Western democratic setting. The things that a lot of political scientists think about are a democratic legitimacy. So the concept that legitimacy really arises through adherence to democratic norms, procedures, and values. And then another concept that has received a lot of attention in the West is procedural justice. So this idea that there's this fairness that can come out of the design of the process for resolving disputes or allocating resources. And that's different from distributive justice, which is looking purely at the outcomes. So are the outcomes fair versus is the process designed in a fair way? And an example of this in the US would be something like the Supreme Court system, the US Supreme Court, where, they have to regularly make decisions on very contentious topics. And in order to survive, basically, public support, they need to have this idea of diffuse support, which is termed a reservoir of favorable attitudes or goodwill that helps members to accept or tolerate outputs to which they're opposed, or the effects of which they see as damaging to their wants, as opposed to specific support or support for particular action or policy. So basically what this means is I support the actions of the Supreme Court because I believe in the overall process. I believe in the overall institution. So even if a particular case is one that I would not have, I think it should have been done another way, I still have this reservoir of this like favorable attitude towards it. And having that is important because when you're a governing body that is making decisions where the public is 50-50 split on a regular basis, that means if you didn't have that every time you made a decision, you'd be losing half of the population. So the community sense of legitimacy of your governing body would decrease pretty quickly. And overall, the US Supreme Court has relatively high public support, and research has shown that it is overall stable over time. So even in some very controversial cases that have happened, such as the Bush versus Gore election, where the Supreme Court stepped in and made a ruling in favor of one presidential candidate over another, the Supreme Court, people did like polling afterwards, they found that the Supreme Court lost some partisan support directly after that decision, but their approval rates kind of bounced back within a year or two. So it's kind of showing that diffuse support again. I'll also mention, just as a caveat though, that the Supreme Court doesn't necessarily mean that the Supreme Court or any governing body with diffuse support can just do whatever they want, right? So research has shown that for the most part, Supreme Court decisions do align with majority public opinion. So it's possible that if this body just started deciding cases that seemed really, really wrong, then over time that they would actually lose support. So having this kind of really robust procedure doesn't necessarily guarantee that people will abide by your decision, like no matter the outcome. Okay, so taking that then, coming back to the governance on our major social media platforms, is it legitimate? So let's talk about what the typical content moderation process is when it comes to something like the Facebook feed. So the status quo today is you've got these company employees, trust and safety teams that are devising policy, and maybe they're getting some external input on how to craft that policy. Then that policy is translated into playbooks, basically, for these paid contract content moderators that are around the world that are trained to manually carry out that policy on cases. In parallel to that, there are also engineering teams employed by the company that develop algorithms to automatically flag and label content, as well as power recommendations. So I think this is the status quo. If we look at sort of recent history in terms of how people are feeling about the status quo, it seems like there might be a legitimacy problem here. So there's been a lot of debate around the power that Facebook wields and the centralized nature of that power. And if you notice from what I just said about the content moderation process, there's very few points for user input in that. And this is kind of one thing that we wanted to study, which was, okay, there's been years, decades of research on democratic legitimacy as a concept. What would it mean to add more democratic legitimacy when it comes to content moderation on social platforms? And so we did a study where we compared the status quo of no user input, some mixture of contract moderators plus algorithmic moderation, with something we wanted to try, which was a digital jury. So juries are also common in the US legal system, where you have cases that come up and then a random selection of citizens within a particular jurisdiction get selected to participate in jury, and you have jury duty like once every couple of years. And we thought, okay, could this form of citizen input provide a more civics-oriented way to think about governance on social media, and could it make things more legitimate through the lever of democratic legitimacy? And we also thought about this in the procedural justice sense. So instead of thinking about this from an outcomes-focused, distributive setting, can we turn it more towards process-focused? Can we get people to think about the process by which these decisions are made? So just a little bit about how we designed the study. So our research questions: how do users perceive democratic legitimacy of the content moderation process involving user juries compared to the status quo? We also had kind of like a sub research question from that, which is comparing a jury process that was voting versus a jury process that engaged in some sort of deliberation. And then the third research question we wanted to ask, could this jury body be something where they're actually enforcing a particular policy, or is it just a recommendation to provide to platforms? And so we built this kind of digital platform for convening juries, and we came up with several cases. We had users go through these cases, participate in juries, and consider how they felt about different types of jury configurations versus not having a jury at all. So these are the three conditions we have here. So the status quo being, you're provided a case and you're provided the outcome and sort of how that outcome was arrived using the status quo. We also had a scalable option, which was just voting. And then we had an immersive option where the jury members actually deliberated with each other. And we had 82 participants split across 15 juries of around 6 people. And we did recruiting over Amazon Mechanical Turk. And you can see a little bit about the demographics there. Okay, so what did we find? So really high level summary of the results. So for research question 1, we found that people felt that there was greater democratic legitimacy on the part of juries, particularly the aspects of power, trust, fairness, and the equal valuing of individual voices and care of personal preferences, but they didn't find a difference when it came to the efficiency of removing toxic content. For research question 2, we found that people appreciated the deliberation aspect more than the blind voting aspect, in particular when it comes to the care of personal preferences. And then for research question 3, we didn't end up finding a significant preference when it came to direct enforcement versus recommendation. There was kind of a split among our participants. And the split we saw kind of breaking down according to like different ideas about trust. So in some cases, people had a lot of mistrust of platforms. In other cases, people had a lot of mistrust in other jurors, which was an interesting thing to see. And then also different ideas about what is fair. So something, some people might think that having a pluralistic perspective is important versus others might worry about like biasing people's opinions by subjecting them to other people's opinions. Okay. So then after this, with a different set of collaborators at Stanford, we did a second study where we decided to compare 4 categories. We compared algorithms, paid contract moderators, an expert panel, and digital juries. And the design of the study was a little bit different. Instead of enrolling people in juries, we instead went out, got a whole bunch of cases, found the ones that were controversial. So that kind of like split our survey participants 50-50. And then we randomly assigned them to a particular condition. So algos, paid mod, expert panels, digital juries, so different process. And then we randomly assigned them to a particular outcome. So, I may be a participant in this study and I get assigned a case about, a post containing hate speech perhaps, and there would just be a description that says like, this was decided by algorithm and the decision was that it should be taken down. So those last 2 things are algorithmically modified such that, or randomly modified such that like another user could see that same case, but it would be stayed up, for instance. And another thing was that we asked people before they saw this description of the decision, with how they thought the case should be handled. So we had an understanding before they saw what happened, what they think about the case. So that'll be useful for understanding the study. So one question that we asked was, how do these 4 different content moderation processes impact people's perception of the institutional legitimacy of this content moderation process in general? And we kind of had written out something that's like Facebook-esque. And then research question 2, so remember we asked people about what they thought about the case before we told them about what happened to the case. And so we wanted to ask here, to what extent does the alignment of outcome of decisions made by a process with individual preferences influence the perceived legitimacy of that process? So if I previously thought that a piece of content should be taken down, if I'm then told that it was left up and it was decided by an expert panel, for instance, do I then think that the expert panel is bad because it didn't agree with me? Or do I think that it's good because I trust the expert panel? So it's just all these different factors that could go into what I think about a process. So what did we find? Summary of our results. So research question 1, we found that a panel of experts overall performed the best. And you can see over there, this is kind of the graph of the average, a composite score of perceived legitimacy and averaged across all of our survey participants. Experts did the best and juries didn't do as well. Juries, contractors, algorithms, they all kind of didn't do as well, and experts were the best, but it wasn't by a lot. Going into the survey responses, there was some qualitative portions. We saw that people, when they talked about why one versus the other, they mentioned a couple things. One was that they really preferred group decision making. So when it came to experts and juries, one of the reasons why they would say like, oh yes, I would want this, is because of this aspect of group decision making over an individual. So that was one interesting point that came out. So answer to the second question though, and this one was interesting. So, yes, we saw some differences across these 4 processes, but the overwhelming important thing that came out was actually that alignment of user preference with the decision outcome dominated over everything else. So it seemed like in this case that the outcome mattered a lot more than the process. So interesting results. So some takeaways from these 2 studies. 1, okay, so it seems like procedural legitimacy could improve some things, in particular, perhaps relying on expertise or relying on deliberative bodies of some kind. However, we all know that experts are few, deliberation can be slow. We're talking about a lot of content here. Another thing that really came out in the second study, so outcomes still matter. Like I was saying in the case of the US Supreme Court, like execution is still important. Procedural, having a robust procedure can get you some buffer. It gets you that diffuse support, but it doesn't mean that outcomes don't matter anymore. And in the case of especially like really, really large volumes of content, maybe speed and this quality of execution is still the overriding factor. And then for folks like me who are really interested in like democracy and furthering democratic governance online, it seems like there is this mistrust in the average user, and we have to think about how to design for that before considering more democratic measures, along with this sense of mistrust in algorithms that we got through a couple of these studies that also needs further examination. Okay, so kind of taking that as it will, I think it leaves a very mixed picture. So I wanted to point to how to take that forward and how that could relate to decentralized social media, which I know is an interest of you all. So one point here, I want to remind you that the studies that we did were really focused on this kind of like large platform setting like Facebook that's making these kind of like global decisions that affect a lot of people. And in these kinds of cases, you may actually really need this kind of diffuse support that the Supreme Court has. And in fact, Facebook convened something called the Facebook Oversight Board, I think about a year ago or 2 years ago. This is like a global set of experts that spend a very long time deliberating over a very small number of cases. But of course, that doesn't scale. Calling the Supreme Court every time you need a decision is definitely overkill. And in fact, in many of our national court systems, there usually is some kind of escalation process, right? You leave the most heavyweight, the most difficult things at the very end of that process. And I think, this is something that could definitely be applied to how we think about content moderation in platforms as well. Instead of funneling every decision up to a top level, who must then decide for everyone, and thus is always making these like very high stakes decisions, could we incorporate greater decentralization and to break up the work, the power, the stakes of these decisions? And a great example of this in the offline setting is federalism, which is this like mixed or compound model of government that has a top level government, it has regional governments at varying levels, and it's all part of a single political system, and it divides the powers between the different levels. And so this is how it looks in the case of platforms. So you have the top level platform operators, global content moderators, platform developers, maybe people working on standards bodies. And then you have what we call middle level units. So these are community managers, administrators of specific servers, maybe even third-party tool developers. And then you have at the bottom level users who can arrange themselves into these different middle level units. Okay, so this multi-level structure of governance that I've laid out, it arises on pretty much all platforms to some degree. There's differences across platforms, particularly in the level of power and responsibilities assigned to the top level. So a top level might be weak or it might be strong, depending on policy on that platform or due to actually technical design. And also how structures arise, were they all decentralized and then some kind of thing emerged bottom up, or is it top down that it was centralized and then some decentralization appeared? Also plays a role in this strength of the top. So examples of this, Facebook platform is at the top, middle Facebook groups, bottom Facebook users. And I'm going in the direction of like strong top, weak middle to weaker top and strong middle. Okay, so another example is Reddit. This is on a centralized platform, but the Reddit global moderators have relatively fewer responsibilities compared to subreddit moderators who do the bulk of the moderation on Reddit. Same thing for Discord. Same thing for WhatsApp, in which case here, it's actually end-to-end encryption that limits the power of the top level. Same thing for a federated decentralized social network like Mastodon. You have the power primarily lying at the level of the middle with the Mastodon server administrators and moderators. And there's a very weak top, which is primarily just setting of the Mastodon standard. Same thing in a peer-to-peer environment where you might be using BitTorrent. You might join a community, a file sharing community with others that have particular rules about like posting and sharing files. And the top here is also very weak. It would be just the BitTorrent protocol. Okay, I should hopefully be done soon, sorry. So legitimacy at different levels then, if we're thinking about this in a multi-level environment, which is the case, as I was saying, on most platforms, whether, regardless of your technical configuration. So there is typically some top level of some kind, and it might be making a lot of decisions, it might be making very few decisions, but if it's at the top level, if it's operating globally, maybe at that point you should be focusing on procedural legitimacy in the form of deliberative expert bodies, and also focusing on efficient enforcement at scale across all the things that come below. And then if you're a middle level, maybe we just need more and more powerful and varied middle levels, because this is actually not so much the case today. And depending on the size of your middle level unit, sometimes a middle level gets really large and basically becomes a platform. But depending on the size of your unit, you could attempt more democratic processes that have a more local version of citizen, right? Because we talked about the mistrust of other people. Maybe you don't trust the average Facebook user because that's over 1 billion people, but you would trust the members of your Facebook group. And just a point here that unfortunately that many platforms today have really poor tooling for middle level governance. And that is an aspect of like research that my group is trying to work on, basically trying to strengthen governance in middle levels, give tools to middle levels out there to be able to have the varied governance that they want, and to be able to carry out more powerfully the governance that they want. So we have a tool called Policy Kit that hooks into communities, these middle levels on any platform. Any platform meaning that any platform that has certain API properties that allow us to work, to be able to enact any kind of governance of their choice, written via these short Python scripts. And we've built integrations to a number of platforms like Slack, Reddit, Discord, Discourse, etc. We have another tool specifically for YouTube that's now targeted at non-programmers who also want to be able to, enact certain content moderation regimes. So a non-programmatic interface for like designing better word filters. And then we also have some ongoing work on thinking about community level governance in end-to-end encrypted platforms like Matrix, Signal, etc. And then just finally, some future ongoing work. So one, thinking about bringing democracy to these online communities, thinking about that middle level, what kind of things could make something like juries work? We have a survey out right now that's looking at a lot of communities across different platforms and to understand how these different communities might be thinking about juries and jury design. Also thinking about bringing more legitimacy to that global top level. So could we learn from offline ideas such as case law, thinking about how to make these top level decisions more effective and consistent and legitimate? Could we have a representative democracy one day? Maybe. Then the last thing, bringing more governance tooling to end users. I didn't talk much today, but there's also the bottom level, which is the users themselves. And typically they have some tools to be able to do some personal moderation. And we're trying to provide more tools there as well. Okay, that's basically all that I had. And I'm excited to see what you all have chatted. I haven't actually seen, and to answer any questions.
I'm not surprised. I mean, you've got some fabulous insights there. Thanks for sharing them. And I'd love to go through some of the comments in the questions. I will refer to some of those comments, but what I'd also love is for people to unmute and ask Amy directly. If there's an awkward silence, I will start to resort to the questions you've bookmarked, so to speak, in the chat. I will start with Chair's prerogative, if I may, just to get the conversation going. You set up front the distinction between emphasizing justice, legitimacy through justice versus procedural legitimacy. And then I believe your research is focused on procedural legitimacy, if I've understood it correctly. Do you see it as an either or could they be anded?
So at least in our projects, I think they go hand in hand. I mean, we're studying different designs for processes, basically, to understand, how much can the process affect things? And it seems like, in some cases, maybe they don't affect things very much, right? Like in the second study we did, the process didn't seem to matter that much to people, and it was more about the outcome. And I think in any legitimate system, you need to have both. You need to have processes that people trust, as well as outcomes that people feel reflect their community's needs.
It's interesting because we had a conversation in December about restorative justice, which is very much about virtue ethics, very much about people feeling that the consequences, the material outcome, the emotional outcome is imperative, emphasizing, I think, and I'm a novice at understanding different forms of legitimacy, Amy, so please don't confuse me for any kind of expert. Therefore, if you like, emphasizing that over the process. So we're trying to figure out, if you pursue a decentralized architecture, how to assess whether the technical and social code you put in place plays to one or the other, or is compatible with both. I mean, it's a it's difficult to pull the design criteria together, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the benefits of decentralization, particularly like these federated structures that I mentioned, is that you get to have that plurality, right? So I in one community can decide that I want to take a more restorative justice approach to things. And maybe in a different community, I would decide that I don't want to. And the benefit of that is that you have plurality of different governance types out there. And then you also have user choice. So people can elect to be in the government that they would like to be in.
Martin, you've switched your camera on. Does that mean you have a question perchance?
No, not. There are so many others. Please.
Okay.
I just want to be that there's a few more cameras on.
Excellent. If you'd like to ask a question, if you just click reactions at the bottom of your screen and then raise your hand, then I can see that and come to you. Otherwise, I will start to go through the comments on the right-hand side here. There's a comment from Mitko here, which relates to the y-axis when you were comparing four different, in your results, when you were comparing the four different approaches. And even though one was slightly ahead of the other, the y-axis was still on 20-something. Could you just clarify what the y-axis was, Amy?
Yes, let me go find that graph really quick.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it was a composite score of 5 Likert scale questions. So basically the number doesn't matter too much, except that you see it as a ratio of the minimum to the maximum. So there were 5 Likert scale questions. So 5 times 5 is 25. That was the top, and then we added all the ratings. Yeah.
So would you look at that graph, and I'm just trying to interpret your research into a design criteria. How would you take your findings and put that into a design criteria? Would you emphasize them in that order, or would you allow for people to make their own choices? I mean, let me just phrase it in terms of federating, because one of the things I've spotted in my understanding of federation in government and federation in computer science is that they don't necessarily map onto each other. I find that federating in government has a innate hierarchy, but in computer science, it's more of a peer-to-peer. Each server instance, every federated instance is considered equal to everyone else. So sometimes the word means something in one context and means something in a different context. It's interesting to see how the federating understanding in governance can map onto the federating understanding in computer science, so that a natural, I think the word is heterarchy, can emerge. So not a hierarchy of powers, but a way in which things could be ranked differently according to different contexts, different cultural needs, to allow the moderating processes in decentralized social networking to suit the context where it's playing out, as opposed to some kind of distant nation state or universal level.
Yeah, so I didn't get time to talk about it in this talk, but federalism is just kind of one example of these hierarchical styles of governance. And there are others that are much less rigid, I guess I would say. So federalism is very how would you call it? Like layered cake as opposed to marble cake kind of design, where you have a nesting doll kind of approach. There are others, and one that we draw on a lot is called polycentricity, which is a lot more flexible in terms of and suits the kind of complex nature, which is actually on the ground in a lot of quote unquote federalist countries, where, you know, ostensibly you have like very clear levels and then peer units within each level, but in actuality, it's actually a lot messier. And polycentricity kind of accounts for that messiness.
Does that relate to polycentricity and plurality? Are they linked concepts?
I don't think so, but I'd have to understand how you're thinking about plurality specifically?
I've been drawn to the topic of plurality recently, just in terms of accommodating the requisite variety in designing for decentralized social networking. So we're trying to understand how you might design a system that doesn't collapse to a singularity, that it maintains a polycentricity, that it maintains a plurality of governance approaches, of cultures, and that they can coexist happily. And I know there's people on the call here who have done a lot more thinking on that than I have, but I won't ask them to by name to step up. But if you do have a contribution to make on that particular topic, please don't be shy. What else came out in the comments here? Greg, how did you know I was actually thinking about you?
Hi. I don't know. It
Thank you,
like
thank you for taking the hint.
It's a coincidence, I suppose, Philip. Yes, I did want to ask a related question to Amy. In the chat, I mentioned, because I wasn't sure in what sense the term plurality was being used, I brought in the concept of majoritarianism. And when we look at your study results, I'm really interested in whether or not the study and the data analysis regarding deliberative bodies, if there was a distinction between decision-making processes in different deliberative bodies. Like, did all of these bodies require unanimous verdicts, or did some of them use majoritarian decision-making internally?
Yeah, in our first study, we actually designed it as in we put people into juries such that, and we required that it be some kind of, that they try to reach consensus, but if they didn't reach consensus in the time period by which the study took place, and that was primarily just for practical reasons, that then they had a final vote at the end. But it kind of didn't matter so much because we weren't presenting the outcome of that jury as like a final decision. It was more like, let's put people in the experience of being in a jury to then talk about how they felt about that experience and whether they felt that was like an empowering process, whether it felt democratically legitimate versus not. In the second study, remember here, we didn't actually convene any juries. It was just like textual descriptions where we said, such and such case happened, there was a jury that convened, and this is what they said. And I don't recall if we specified in the description whether or not that consensus was a unanimous one or some kind of, I don't know, vote at the end or split vote or something like that. So yeah, I don't remember if we did that, but I could see how that might affect the decision. We would have to study that. Yeah.
Just for everybody here, Greg, could you just explain as briefly as you might that you're invoking or talking about majoritarianism because it's something that we need to avoid, as opposed to, on the sound of it, democracy is based on the majority voting for one or the other. That's how democracy works. But you're definitely raising it here as a concern.
Yes, I enter this conversation as somebody who's been very deeply in favor of seeking consent-based structures at all levels of organizing for quite a few years now. In fact, I am an anarchist by most definitions, perhaps, although I don't think anarchism has ever scaled well beyond small groups of people. That's the whole thing. It's very hard to have inclusive consent-based processes in large groups of people, but talk about federation and polycentrism, I think, is very closely related to whether or not we can scale consent-based inclusive processes to large groups of people. But yes, to put it in a nutshell, I think majoritarian processes should always be avoided outside of dire emergency situations, such as, Amy, thank you for your context. If these groups were trying their best to achieve a unanimous position for much of the time that they spent together, I think that's very valuable. And then if they ended up doing something else at the end, that data is also very valuable. So thank you.
We have a question here from Bogdana. I can read it, or you're more than welcome to ask it yourself, Bogdana. There you are, marvelous.
Jump in. Hi, Amy. So good to see you, and hi, Philip, and everyone. So good to see you. But yeah, really great conversation. I was wondering, Amy, you mentioned about the sort of existing projects require platforms to have a specific kind of API. And so I was wondering about this sort of relationship with the platform companies themselves, and then was curious about like the project with YouTube that you mentioned, and I guess more broadly, like, are you seeing interest from platform companies to engage, and sort of what can we do to incentivize them, I guess, to better engage?
Yeah, definitely. I talked very briefly about those projects. So PolicyKit is kind of like a technology stack, I guess, that tries to hook into platforms and then take over the governance of that platform for that particular community. It's because, you know, we want, for instance, to be able to have elections on Zoom or Slack or, you know, whatever community that we're on, but we're captured by the software. And, you know, as a third party, we don't have the ability to like change the platform's code or the client's code. And so what PolicyKit does is it uses the platform's APIs. So it needs to basically give us the ability to listen to all actions, be able to revert actions, and be able to take actions, which many platforms do have that capability. And so once we have those abilities, then PolicyKit can kind of listen for things that happen and take back things that shouldn't happen according to the governance that the community has created on PolicyKit, and then carry out actions that the community on PolicyKit has decided. So basically, we're kind of like using this alternative system for designing governance, and then just kind of like porting that over to the various platforms that communities are on. And then for the case of YouTube, again, we're using third-party, an API there, and it's a third-party tool where we're saying, okay, the governance tooling that YouTube content creators, who are a small governance unit in themselves, in many cases, they're moderating the comments that appear underneath their content. They have very limited tools in order to do so. It's like extremely rudimentary. So, you know, we designed a better system, we think, for being able to create more complicated, more powerful governance, and then let YouTube users be able to use their tool to actually do the moderation on YouTube over those comments. And then you had a question about whether platforms are getting more interested in this. I think so. There's been a lot of discussion about third-party tooling and ways that platforms could better support third-party tooling. A lot of times it's very fragile because APIs change quite quickly, and it's very easy for these things to become obsolete. This happened with Twitter block lists. People had built all these third-party tooling to be able to share block lists with each other to help people deal with harassment on Twitter. And then a change in the Twitter API basically made all these tools unable to work, like as of, I think, last year. So I think that would be a big place where platforms could do better, is better signaling around these APIs, as well as a number of other things. But yeah, we'll see how much we move in that direction.
One of the things we have been reflecting on is obviously the volume of interactions. One of the advantages of federated structure is that you have, by definition, a subset of the whole. So you can focus on governing, moderating in that smaller community, as opposed to 2.5 billion people on one platform. But subsets is only one aspect of volume. It's the rate of interactions as well, Amy, that is just frightening. And especially when a lot of that is perhaps created not by people, but by bots. So wondering in your work around legitimacy, whether understanding who at dog 69 actually is, whether it's a person or whether it's a person who's been around for a while or whether it's not a person at all, came into the question of legitimacy?
Yeah, that's always an important question. The notion of like citizenship, basically. I think that there are a lot of things that are being tried online that, or a lot of proposals that people have been making online that I think are interesting. I think one of these is the idea that being on the internet kind of gives one superpowers, and maybe those superpowers should be reined in somewhat, such that, like, you know, in the offline world, like, we can only say one thing at a time, we can only talk to so many people at a time, and in the online world that need not be the case because of technology. But platforms or software that governs communities could make it such that we don't have those superpowers, or that we only have those superpowers if we've risen to a level of like, if we have a track record and if we've shown that we're responsible, we can responsibly use those superpowers. Superpowers meaning being able to, like, post, you know, 50 times a minute or something, or being able to wield multiple accounts at the same time, or the level of content, the size of content that one can produce. All these kinds of things can add moderation load. And I think there's an interesting question as to whether there might be like on-ramps for that.
Yeah, it's almost like we need to slow it down. I mean, it sounds a little bit odd, but sometimes I think of this space, the digitalization of social interactions, as how can we limit the superpowers that the digital technologies give us? It sounds weird because we've only just discovered them, but they seem to be full on, and it would be good to just to turn the tap off a little bit and add some frictions. That's another way of putting it back into the system. Friction is an important property of the system. Sometimes you want to eliminate it for fuel efficiency in a car. Sometimes you need it to bring the car to a halt. So friction is just a system parameter, and I'm just wondering how that friction corresponds to the question of legitimacy. Would people perceive frictions as contributing to legitimacy, or see them as, how dare you introduce frictions into my godlike powers on this in this digital network? So lots of questions in the mix. Well done. Did you have any contributions that you could add here about the use of AI in social networks and the legitimacy aspect of doing so?
I think you're referring to that comment in the chat. Yeah, it was the previous question, so not necessarily, but maybe to your point on friction, I think, like, absolutely, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of conflict resolution on platforms, and I guess in terms of both understanding of in some way, like, algorithmic harm that encompasses both algorithmic actors as well as other humans on the platform, right? So sort of how are we thinking about sort of the interactions between people and the way that whatever it is, I don't know, a recommender engine or like some kind of algorithm behind the sort of platform that also sort of impacts my experience, right, on the platform, and then how do we account for that friction in a way that can be positive, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does to me. It's just it's about framing it and communicating it, because every time we make a design decision, that needs legitimacy in itself. It's like the legitimacy of the legitimacy. It's you could actually end up doing nothing in a day because you've just you just boxed yourself into such a corner. You're frightened to make a move, but that's not the AKASHA Foundation style, I'm pleased to say. I'm conscious of time. Martin's just going to post a couple of links into the chat here so that we can continue the conversation after the conversation, if you like. Thanks for doing that.
So just Philip, you want to say something, or I do it? I may say a few words to this. So
yeah, sure.
I mean, especially because today we had such a rich discussion and a lot of comments, we really invite you to join the discourse forum that we have created. Let me paste this link in a moment. We created a post there already for this specific conversation where you just are free and welcome to comment. But if there's anything else, you will see we are currently focusing a lot on moderating, and obviously there's something also in context for the conversations. Feel free to open new topics there. We are really interested to see a rich conversation happening in this forum, and we'll also ping you probably with the follow-up email to remind everyone. Yeah, that's what I want to say. And for everyone that also is interested in the POAP, I remind you again, you can sign up for akasha.ethereum.world, and I paste again also that specific link here. That's the post, and you can reply to it. We are testing at this time also how many replies can our reply system cope with, hopefully. And we get more than 2. Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. Much appreciated. I have one last question for you, Amy. How can everyone on this Zoom call help you?
Yeah, I think we're always looking for active contributors to our projects. So if you check out our lab website, it's I'll put the link in the chat, social.cs.washington.edu. There we have links to our projects, our papers. You can find the GitHub repositories, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you so much. That's been absolutely just what we needed in the AKASHA Conversations. It's interesting, at the top of the call, I mentioned, if you think social networking is hard, try decentralizing it. But it seems to me that one of the things that I can interpret from your presentation, Amy, is that perhaps the only way we might get the requisite complexity, perhaps the only way to do social networking that is a net benefit, that allows for human flourishing, is to decentralize it. So let's continue this conversation. Thanks very much again. We will, of course, be posting this video to the AKASHA blog and also on the discourse, so you can watch it again and grapple with it. And I'm sure we will see everybody in April. We will be announcing on Twitter who our guests will be at that point, and of course on Ethereum World and on Discourse and everywhere you expect to see us. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you very much, Amy. I don't know if anybody wants to just unmute and do the round of applause the old-fashioned way, but thank you very much for joining us. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.